The rain had been coming down for 2 hours, and she was still standing at the gate, not pacing, not calling out, just standing with one hand on the post and a bag at her feet that had gone dark with water, looking at the lit window of a house she had never seen before, the way a person looks at the only lamp in a very long darkness. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were open. She had knocked once, and she was waiting. And if the answer was no, she had already decided what she would do next. That was the kind of woman Rose Calloway was, the kind that makes a plan before she makes a plea. The door had not opened yet. Grover County, Wyoming, October of 1882. The Aldridge Ranch sat on 340 acres of eastern valley slope, good grazing land with a solid barn and a creek that ran clear 9 months of the year and froze honest in the 10th. The house had 4 rooms. 2 of them had been closed since the winter of 1879. Eli Aldridge had closed them himself, one afternoon in March after the ground thawed enough to dig, and he had not opened them since. He was 44 years old. He ran the ranch alone. 2 hands helped him through summer, young men from town who took their wages in September and didn't come back until May, and in the months between, Eli Aldridge moved through the work the way he moved through everything, steadily, without comment, without expectation that anything would be different tomorrow than it had been today. His wife, Clara, had died 3 years ago. Not sudden. The fever had taken its time, the way fevers do when they intend to be thorough, and Eli had sat with her through all of it, and when it was done he had buried her under the cottonwood east of the house and gone back to work the next morning. That was what people said about him afterward, that he went back to work the next morning. Some said it admiringly. Eli had no opinion about it. He simply hadn't known what else to do. The kitchen table had been built for 3. Their son had gone to Cheyenne 2 years ago, railroad work, letters at Christmas. The chair that faced the window had been Clara's. Eli had not moved it. He ate alone every evening. He made 1 cup of coffee every morning. He went to church on Sundays and the feed store on Thursdays and came home both times without anything having changed. The town of Grover considered him decent and reliable and entirely closed, the way a house is closed when the people inside have decided that what they have is sufficient and further weather is not welcome. He had almost convinced himself they were right. Rose Calloway had arrived in Grover 3 days before she knocked on Eli's door. She had come from Cheyenne with a plan, a cousin who had written promising work at the Holt boarding house, a place to stay while she found her footing. She arrived to find the cousin gone to Denver and the position filled and $4.60 to her name. She was 31 years old. She had been moving since she was 22, when the Nebraska homestead her family had built failed in the drought of '73, and the particular discipline of a life that required constant motion had made her capable in ways the town of Grover would not immediately recognize. She could cook and keep accounts and tend animals and fix a fence post in ground that had gone soft. She had taught herself to read a ledger from a manual ordered from a Chicago publisher because there had been no one to teach her. She did not ask for help she didn't need. What she needed on that October night was a roof. Reverend Aldis had let her sleep in the church vestibule for 3 nights with the quiet tolerance of a man doing what was right and hoping the situation resolved itself. On the 4th night, the church was locked. The Reverend was away in Laramie until Sunday. The rain came down without consulting her opinion. She walked until she saw a lit window. She opened the gate. She knocked once. She waited. Eli heard the knock the way you hear things when you have spent 3 years listening to a house that makes no noise, immediately, completely, with the particular alertness of someone for whom silence has become the default and interruption requires processing. He almost didn't answer. It was past 9. The rain was loud. He had learned over 3 years that late knocks rarely carried good news. He set down his book and went to the door with the expression of a man prepared to be briefly inconvenienced. What he saw stopped that expression before it finished forming. A woman. Soaked through, dressed dark with rain from the collar down, one hand still on the door frame as if she had needed the support of something solid to complete the crossing from gate to porch. a bag at her feet. Her hair had come half loose from its pins and was lying flat against her neck. She was not young and not old, somewhere in the middle of her life, and she was looking at him with eyes that were green and steady and entirely without self-pity. Not performing distress, not calculating effect, just waiting with the patience of someone who has already decided what they will do if the answer is no. "Just let me stay one night," she said. "I'll be gone before your hands are up." The word no was forming. He could feel it, familiar as a habit, reliable as a fence post. He had been saying no to things for 3 years, not out of meanness, out of the specific exhaustion of a man who has learned that yes costs more than the moment it is set in. Then he looked at her hands. Her right hand was gripping the door frame. Not dramatically. The way a person grips something when they have been standing in cold rain for longer than they intended, and the body is asking for rest that the will is not quite ready to grant. The knuckles were white, not from cold, from the effort of standing still and asking instead of just enduring. He stepped aside. Not yes, just aside. The word never came. The door opened and he moved out of the way and she walked in, and that was how it started. Not with a decision, but with the absence of one. She stood in the kitchen and looked at it the way a person looks at a room when they are reading it. The single plate on the table, the one cup on the shelf above the stove, the 2 closed doors down the hall, the chair facing the window, pushed slightly apart from the table, as if it had been moved back by someone who stood up and never came back to push it in. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. He noticed that she said nothing, and something about that, the absence of comment, the clean acceptance of what a room contained, lodged in him like a splinter. Small, noticeable only when he pressed on it. He put coffee on. He did not ask her preference. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup when he set it in front of her and closed her eyes for one moment. Not dramatically, just the small, private surrender of someone who has been holding themselves together for long enough that warmth requires adjustment. "Eli Aldridge," he said. "Rose Calloway." She opened her eyes. "I came from Cheyenne. I had work arranged. It fell through." He nodded. He did not ask further. She did not offer further. The rain pushed at the windows and the fire moved in the grate, and the kitchen was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 3 years, except that this time someone else was in it. She slept in the spare room. He lay awake for an hour listening to the rain and not thinking about the chair by the window and the way she had not mentioned it. In the morning she was already in the kitchen when he came down. The fire was lit. The coffee was made. 2 cups on the table side by side as naturally as if they had always been there. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the 2 cups. He sat down. Neither of them said anything about it. She asked about work on the second morning. Not charity, work. She said it plainly the way she said everything, looking at him directly, no performance around the edges. He looked at her for a long moment. "The barn needed mucking," he said. The kitchen accounts hadn't been properly kept since June. He named a wage. She said it was fair. She went to the barn. He told himself it was practical. The ranch needed the help. He had been managing alone and the accounts had suffered and winter was coming. That was the whole of it. He told himself this several times over the following days, which was one more time than a man needs to tell himself something that is simply true. 10 days in, he was repairing the south fence line in the late afternoon when she appeared at the post he was working, 2 cups of coffee in her hands, walking across the frozen ground in a coat that was too light for Wyoming in October. She handed him one without asking. He took it without thanking her. They stood at the fence and looked at the mountains, and she said, "Which pastures flood in spring?" He told her. She asked which sections went sparse in dry years, where the creek ran deep enough to matter for the cattle, whether the south slope was worth seeding in April. The questions of someone building a map, not small talk, not conversation for the sake of filling silence. She was learning the land the way you learn a person, by paying attention to what it told you without meaning to. He answered more than he planned to. He talked about the ranch the way he had not talked about it in 3 years, not because there had been no one to talk to, but because there had been no one who asked with that quality of listening, the kind that receives rather than waits. She told him about Nebraska, about the homestead and the drought and her father's face the morning the bank came, and how she had been moving since then. 9 towns, she said. Always the stranger, always the one who had arrangements elsewhere. She was tired of having arrangements elsewhere. I'm tired of moving, she said. Not to him exactly, to the mountains, the way people say true things when they are not quite ready to say them directly. He looked at her. She looked at the mountains. He went back to the fence post. That evening he ate at a table set for 2, and did not examine the fact that it had happened without discussion. 2 weeks after she arrived, he came in from the barn at 7 in the morning to find the kitchen ledger open on the table, 3 pages of notes beside it in her handwriting. Precise, small, organized. 2 months of billing errors. A feed supplier overcharging on every 3rd order, a way to restructure the winter feed costs that would save close to $40 before March. He stood at the table and read it, all of it. He read the notes twice. When she came in from checking the east fence, he was still standing there. He said, "The Henderson account, you found that." "It was there," she said. She took her coat off and hung it on the peg by the door. He said nothing further. He nodded once, the way he nodded at things that were solid and right and required no further comment. She did not look at him when he nodded, but the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. The kind of thing that is over before you can be sure you saw it. The town of Grover noticed, because small towns notice everything and have opinions about what they notice before the relevant parties have finished deciding how they feel about it themselves. It was Martha Greer at the general store who said what everyone was thinking, with the directness of a woman who has operated a dry goods counter for 20 years and has found euphemism to be inefficient. Rose had come in for salt and flour on a Wednesday morning, and Martha had looked at her with the assessing warmth of someone who had already made up her mind and was simply confirming. "You're the woman staying at the Aldridge place," she said. Not a question. "I am," Rose said. Martha was quiet for a moment, weighing. Then, "That man has not had a fire lit before 7 in 3 years. She handed Rose her change. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying." Rose took the change and walked back to the ranch faster than she needed to. She told herself it was because the wind had picked up. She sat on the porch steps that evening and was honest with herself in the way she had always been honest with herself, because dishonesty was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She was not here because of the wages. She had known that for a week. She stayed because this place had the particular quality of somewhere that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. A house with closed rooms and a chair by a window and accounts that needed someone to look at them properly, and a man who moved through his days with the steadiness of water finding its level, and who said true things plainly without decoration. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she was saving wages. She told herself she would leave in spring. She told herself this the way you tell yourself things you are not quite sure of anymore. It was a man named Dalton who came by on a Saturday with a wagon load of milled lumber Eli had ordered. He was 38, prosperous, the kind of man who understood the value of being seen to be prosperous. He saw Rose in the yard and found a reason to stay 20 minutes past the delivery. He asked her if she was going to the Grover Harvest Social. He said he would be glad to escort her if she was free. He said it pleasantly, with the ease of a man who has not been told no recently and does not expect to be. Rose said she would think about it. Eli came out of the barn at the tail end of this. He looked at Dalton. He looked at Rose. He went back inside. That evening he was quieter than usual, not cold, just reduced, somehow, pulled back from the surface of things. Rose set supper on the table and he ate and said 3 words across the whole meal, and she did not ask about Dalton and he did not mention Dalton, and the kitchen held its silence the way it had held it for 3 years, except that this version of silence had a different weight. She sat with it on the porch afterward, and understood something she had been almost understanding for 2 weeks. The harvest social came and went. She did not go with Dalton. She did not go at all. She told herself she had accounts to finish. That was true. It was not the whole truth. 3 weeks after Dalton's visit, on an evening in early November when the first real cold had come down from the north and the mountains were showing snow on their high faces, Rose and Eli sat on the porch the way they had begun to sit on porches in the evenings, side by side without arrangement, watching the Wyoming dark come in across the valley. She was mending. He was looking at the mountains. She said, without looking up from her work, "You moved Clara's chair." A long silence. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods. "I know," he said. Another silence, the kind that has several things in it. Then, quietly, "It was time." She kept her eyes on her mending. He kept his eyes on the mountains. Neither of them said anything further. But something between them that had been held carefully in place for 5 weeks shifted without permission and did not shift back. Before we go on, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. From Wyoming to wherever this voice is reaching you, it means everything to know. Now let's get back, because Eli Aldridge is about to find out what Rose Calloway is made of. The storm came down from Canada in the second week of November, the way Wyoming storms come, not gradually, but all at once, as if the mountains had simply decided and the valley had no vote. Eli went out at 4 in the afternoon to move the cattle to the near pasture before the temperature dropped below useful. He said he would be back by 6. He was not back by 6. Rose put supper on and waited. She told herself he had stopped to check the water line. She told herself he was fine. She told herself 7 different things while the wind picked up and the temperature outside dropped through the floorboards and into the kitchen. At 6:30, she took the lantern off the hook and went out. She found him a half-mile from the house, at the frozen edge of the creek, moving slow. He had slipped on the bank checking the water line. "Nothing broken," he said before she asked, the way men say these things. But his right ankle was wrenched and he was cold in the particular way that is dangerous rather than uncomfortable. She did not make a production of it. She got under his arm. She got him back to the house. She sat him down in the kitchen chair, not Clara's chair, the other one, and looked at his ankle with the calm efficiency of someone who has dealt with worse in worse conditions, and she wrapped it tight and made him tea. Not coffee. Tea, because it was what her mother had made when things went wrong, and she did not explain this. He watched her. The kettle on the stove, her hands working without hurry, the lamp casting its circle on the kitchen wall. He watched her and said nothing for a long time, which was not unusual, except that this silence was different from the ones before it. This one was full rather than empty. He said, "Why are you still here, Rose?" She went still, her hands on the cup, the question sitting in the kitchen like a third person. Not the ankle, not tonight. Why are you still here? She could have said the wages. She could have said the winter, the weather, the practical logic of a woman with sense and nowhere better to be. She set the cup on the table. She turned and looked at him directly. The first time in weeks she had let herself look at him the way she actually looked at him, without the layer of careful management between the looking and the showing. "Because this is the first place," she said, "that felt like it was waiting for someone." The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the storm threw itself against the windows with the indifference of weather that has no opinion about what happens inside houses. Eli Aldridge looked at Rose Calloway across his kitchen table and understood, with the full weight of 3 years of closed rooms and single cups, what he had been doing with all that quiet. He had been waiting, too. He just hadn't known what for. He found her at the south fence in December, the same section they had stood at in October with their coffee and their questions about the land. The snow was on the high peaks. The air had the cold, clean quality of a Wyoming winter that does not negotiate. She was checking the post he had repaired 2 months ago, pressing her palm against the wood the way you test a thing you want to trust. He came to stand beside her. He was holding his hat in both hands. Outside, in the open, in October cold. He always wore his hat outside. She looked at his hands and understood what that meant before he spoke. "I know what this place has been," he said. He looked at the fence post. "I know Clara's chair is still by the window, and that doesn't disappear. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise." He looked up at her. "But I've been watching you fix things I didn't know were broken. The accounts, the South Post, the way the kitchen feels at 7 in the morning." He paused. "I'd like you to stay, not for wages. I'd like you to stay because I'm asking you to." She looked at this man, 44 years old, hat in his hands, 3 years of silence on his face and something new underneath it, something that had the quality of a door opened rather than closed. "You almost said no," she said. "That first night." "I know," he said. "What stopped you?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is thinking rather than avoiding. "Your hands," he said. "On the gate post." She took the hat from his hands. She held it. That was her answer. They both understood it was her answer. They married in February, on a Saturday, when the valley was still white. But the worst of the winter had passed, and the light had the quality of a season that was deciding to change. The Grover church was full, because Grover was a small town, and small towns attend things that matter, and this one, the closing of 3 years of closed rooms, the reopening of a house that had been waiting without knowing it, this one, the town had decided, mattered. Martha Greer sat in the second pew and did not pretend she was not crying, which she had no interest in pretending. Reverend Aldis kept the ceremony short, because both parties had indicated a preference for brevity, and he had found over 20 years that brief ceremonies were truer ones. Rose walked in alone. She had no one to give her away and had declined the alternatives offered with polite efficiency. She wore a dress she had made herself, deep blue, the color of a Wyoming sky in the last hour before dark. Not white. She had no interest in white. The blue suited her, and she had chosen it without consulting anyone's opinion, which was how she made all her decisions. Eli stood at the altar and watched her come toward him and thought, with the particular clarity that arrives at moments of genuine importance, about a gate in the rain and a woman with her jaw set and her knuckles white who had knocked once and waited, and about a word that had started to form and hadn't finished. He had stepped aside instead of back. He thought about that. He thought about what would have been lost if he hadn't. 3 years on. The ranch was different. Not the land, the feeling. 2 cups of coffee every morning, set out the night before now, a habit that had formed without discussion, and which neither of them would have been able to say who started. Clara's chair still sat at the kitchen table, but there was a child in it. A girl with her mother's steady eyes and her father's habit of looking at things twice before speaking about them. They had named her Clara, because Rose had said it was right, and Eli had held her when she said it and not spoken for a moment, and she had waited, and when he had finally said, "Yes, that is right," she had simply nodded. The south fence held. The accounts were clean. The 2 rooms down the hall were open. On autumn evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the Wyoming light go gold across the valley, the mountains doing what they always did, and Eli still said less than most men, and Rose had stopped needing him to say more, because she had learned to read the language of a man who showed things rather than named them, in fence posts repaired before they were asked about, in coffee made before she came downstairs, in the way he looked at her when she wasn't looking, with the expression of a man who has been given something he had stopped expecting and is still, 3 years later, not entirely accustomed to the weight of it. He thought sometimes about that gate, about a woman in the rain with her jaw set and a word on his lips that had not finished forming. He thought about it without regret, with something closer to wonder. Eli Aldridge almost said no, not out of cruelty, not out of selfishness, out of the particular exhaustion of a man who has been alone long enough that the door starts to feel safer closed than open. He had built a life inside that closed door, orderly, sufficient, requiring nothing from anyone. He had confused sufficiency with contentment. He had confused closed with protected. Most of us have stood at that door. Most of us have had the word no on our lips when what was standing on the other side was exactly what we had stopped looking for. We do not always say it out loud. Sometimes we just don't open the door. Sometimes we open it and step back instead of aside. Sometimes we let the rain make our decision for us and call it weather and call it circumstance and call it the wrong time. The bravest thing Eli Aldridge did was not the proposal at the fence line. It was the step sideways on a rainy October night when a word was already forming and he did not let it finish. You do not have to be ready. You do not have to have the right words or the healed enough heart or the circumstances that make sense on paper. You do not have to have all the closed rooms open before you let someone in. Sometimes the only thing required is that you move aside rather than back. Rose Calloway knocked once. She was prepared for no. She had already made her plan for no. But the door opened, and somewhere in Wyoming, there is a little girl named Clara who will grow up inside the warmth of that one moment without ever knowing it happened. If this story gave you something to carry, leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, when Rose knocked on that door, were you afraid Eli was going to say no? Until next time, keep writing.